The philosophy of the world today is very straightforward. We present an alternative view to what is usually being seen on BBC, CNN, the bulk of mainstream European or Japanese television networks, which effectively cover world politics, the economic crisis from a similar point of view. So despite the diversity of mainstream channels, the so-called diversity, in fact, it's all the same. And when the opportunity was offered by Telesur in South America to present an alternative news program, culture, analysis, we jumped on it. And the world today covers all the continents, but from a slightly different point of view. And this point of view is largely from below. The views that are rarely aired or spoken of on mainstream television, that are critical of mainstream television coverage of what is going on in the world, and which don't forget history and what has happened. Because one of the diseases at the moment is presentism. We just think about the present, what's happening today, what happened yesterday, that's it. You never see detailed coverage of why what happened yesterday actually happened. And in the world today, we contextualize current affairs, politics, the economic crisis by putting it in a perspective that often reaches back 50 years and sometimes even more than that. And that enables people to understand what is going on. It's a very opinionated show. Of that, there's no doubt. And for that, no apologies. But it's a show which, even if you disagree with, will compel you to think. Because in the end, it's a show that reaches parts of the body that other programs tend to avoid, the brain.
Hemos conseguido muchas cosas. De alguna manera Podemos ha contribuido a cambiar el mapa político español y podemos afirmar que ya hay elementos irreversibles, que ya nada será igual. Yo recuerdo hace 4 años donde nos sorprendió el 15M a todos nosotros, y nos sorprendió aquí en La Tuerca, en un momento de gran frustración, porque se estaban produciendo las primaveras árabes y nosotros teníamos la sensación de que aquí no pasaba nada. Y entonces llegó el 15M, que sorprendió en primer lugar a la izquierda. La izquierda no tuvo nada que ver con esa explosión democrática que fue el 15M. Y nosotros utilizamos la tuerca para empezar a reflexionar sobre lo que estaba ocurriendo. Y, digamos, teníamos ya una reflexión gramsciana en la que pensábamos: el 15M es un indicador de que hay una crisis de régimen, una crisis orgánica, y su mayor expresión social es el movimiento de los indignados. Pero eso no tuvo traducción política inmediatamente. En las siguientes elecciones la derecha tuvo un enorme éxito electoral y también el Partido Socialista. Pero los ingredientes de una nueva política, ingredientes que tenían que ver con la democracia y con una enorme desafección con las élites económicas y políticas, abrían la posibilidad de hacer algo políticamente. Si el 15M fue la mejor expresión social de esa crisis orgánica, Podemos fue la mejor expresión política. Por eso, de alguna forma, somos tan diferentes respecto a expresiones clásicas de la izquierda, porque hemos utilizado ingredientes nuevos para entender que hay una posibilidad de cambio político. Ya han cambiado muchas cosas. Otros líderes políticos se han remangado las camisas, se han quitado la corbata, han hablado de primarias, han hablado de regeneración, pero nosotros queremos intentar ganar las elecciones.
If Syriza is defeated, it will have a bad impact on the whole of Europe, and especially on insurgent movements like Podemos.
Indudablemente, si al gobierno griego le va mal, eso no será bueno para nosotros, aunque yo creo que no sería definitivo. Creo que lo que ocurre en otros países tiene una influencia limitada. Digamos, puede notarse mucho entre opinadores en periódicos importantes o en, digamos, ciertas élites, pero creo que la gente en España no está votando con una conciencia internacional de lo que ocurre en Europa. Yo creo que el gobierno griego lo está haciendo bien. Creo que los niveles de apoyo social que tienen entre el pueblo griego, mayores incluso que dentro del propio partido, creo que hay menos críticas en la sociedad griega a la gestión del gobierno que dentro de la propia formación. Hace que quizá el margen pueda funcionar. Creo que Syriza, con muchas dificultades, está logrando cumplir su programa y está logrando llegar a acuerdos que son muy difíciles y que implican contradicciones, pero yo no veo la situación como o derrota en el Eurogrupo o salida del euro. Creo que van a poder surfear durante un tiempo y ver qué es lo que ocurre en otros países de Europa. Creo además que de alguna forma, paradójicamente, tanto Syriza como nosotros estamos ocupando el papel que ha abandonado la socialdemocracia. Lo hemos visto en Reino Unido. El Partido Nacional Escocés ha arrasado al Partido Laborista precisamente criticando la austeridad y criticando las políticas de recortes. Y eso tiene que ver con el fracaso de la tercera vía, de Tony Blair y de Anthony Giddens. Y creo que nosotros podemos ocupar un espacio que entienda que Europa todavía se puede salvar si está asociada a la prosperidad y a los derechos sociales. Y hemos dicho una cosa, tanto los griegos como nosotros: si la alternativa no somos nosotros, a lo mejor dentro de poco tiempo Merkel tiene que negociar en el Eurogrupo con Marine Le Pen y eso sería ya un escenario aterrador en Europa.
How do you think the elections are going to turn out?
En las generales pueden pasar muchas cosas, pero si nosotros no ganamos en las generales, es evidente que habrá elementos irreversibles, que tendremos mucho futuro, pero ya será otro futuro. Ya seremos una fuerza política consolidada, con cargos públicos, con una presencia parlamentaria, digamos, estable. Ya no seremos outsiders. Nosotros ahora somos outsiders, somos como los bárbaros de Cavafis llegando. Ahora hay una oportunidad. Si esta oportunidad se cierra y nos construimos como una fuerza de oposición parlamentaria, la política nunca acaba y habrá futuro, pero será un futuro ya con características completamente distintas y yo no sé si yo tendré un papel tan relevante en ese futuro.
On the 5th of February, the European Central Bank opened the hostilities, and they cut actually the main channel for financing the Greek banks. The Greek banks, and therefore the Greek economy as a whole, since February, is financed only via an emergency mechanism, which is called the ELA, which is there only for, a short period of time, only as an emergency actually. And it is given, the liquidity is provided at a very slow pace and, in a very careful way. So the whole of Greek economy since early February is actually subjected to an enormous pressure. Greece has re-entered recession. The revenue of the state is declining. And in the meanwhile, Greece has to repay its debt, which it did. And it is the only country in Europe which is servicing its public debt without any kind of financial aid. Greece hasn't received any financial support, let's call it that way, from the European Union since last summer, since August 2014. The result is that 3 months and a half after this, the state coffers are nearly empty. Greece is at the verge of a default. So this pressure and this blackmailing has brought the Syriza government to its knees, has forced this government to make enormous concession in February when it signed the February the 20th agreement with the rest of the Eurogroup, actually. Since then, the hands of the governments are to a very large extent tied, and Syriza is unable actually to implement its program. So if no alternative strategy is implemented by the government, then I think that a political disaster might happen quite soon, actually. And at that point, I think that the government made perhaps an even more serious mistake than accepting those concessions. And the even more serious mistake was that instead of saying to the people, look, we had to make concessions, at that specific moment, let's say in February the 20th, we had no other choice because we were not prepared actually for another scenario, because the banks were on the verge of collapse, because of all that pressure that had been put on us. But this is a very serious concession, and let's open up the debate to see what we're going to do in the future. Instead of saying this, at the first stage they said, oh, this is a very good agreement, this is nearly a success, this is the proof that, you know, negotiations are possible, that we were going ahead, we have bought time. That was the main argument, actually. And now we can see that, you know, the time was not on the side of the government, the time is on the side of the lenders, on the side of the European Union, and the government now admits it. They say we have made a very serious mistake because this agreement didn't provide any guarantee for the provision of liquidities. On the contrary, you know, the pressure continued. But why did they expect to happen otherwise? This is almost mysterious, and I think that the root of the issue, Tariq, is that Syriza, as the rest of the European radical left, feels itself part of the so-called European project, actually. And they are not prepared mentally, in a way, to break at a certain moment with that framework.
Patrick, let's begin by inquiring about the origins of the Islamic State group, ISIS as they call themselves. Where do they come out from, and when did this start?
Well, they come most immediately from Al-Qaeda in Iraq, which was at the height of its influence in 2006, 2007, when it was an element, but not the only element, in the Sunni resistance to a Shia government and the American occupation. Ideologically, it comes out of the jihadi movement, and actually its religious beliefs are not that much different from Saudi Wahhabism, the variant of Islam, which is effectively the state religion of Saudi Arabia, with its denigration of Shia as heretics, Christians, Jews. It's just carrying these beliefs to a higher and more violent level. But it's very much in the context of the jihadi movement.
This jihadi movement did not exist in Iraq as such prior to the American invasion and occupation.
No, it didn't. And Saddam arrested anybody who was an obvious jihadi. I mean, it was always an absurd pretense at the time of the invasion of Iraq to say that Saddam had any connection with the jihadis or 9/11, though such was the volume of propaganda at the time that 60% of Americans believed that somehow Saddam was linked to 9/11.
A lot of people have speculated that the Saudis, in some form or the other, if not the government directly, people close to the government in Saudi Arabia, were responsible for partially creating, helping, and funding this force as a sort of proto-Saudi intervention against Shia domination in Iraq after the occupation. To what extent is this true, if at all?
The Saudis have always been behind the jihadi movement in general, above all abroad, not within Saudi Arabia. And generally, they will support those who oppose Shia governments and don't really distinguish, or didn't really distinguish, who they were supporting. But it's also pretty clear that a lot of their support did go to ISIS, did go to other groups like Jabhat al-Nusra. This was often through private donors, not just Saudi Arabia, but Kuwait and Qatar and Turkey. That the US and Britain would distinguish between the moderate Syrian opposition in this corner and the jihadi extreme opposition in the other corner. But actually the two were together. I mean, there was a report this very week by a research organization itemizing various weapons in the hands of ISIS that appear to have been supplied by Saudi Arabia last year to supposedly moderate Syrian opposition, but were immediately transferred because the gap between the two is much more limited than you'd imagine.
If we just move to Syria for a bit, what is your impression of the current state of play with the sort of emergence of ISIS, not just the emergence, but the successes of ISIS?
So it's rather an extraordinary situation that there you have America and the Westerners and powers saying, we're going to intervene against ISIS, but we're not going to do anything to help Assad. But Assad is the main enemy of ISIS. Yeah. And if they're trying to weaken Assad, then they help ISIS. And it's the result of their, to my mind, catastrophic policies over the last 2 years.
The name of this group is called Boko Haram. Boko, if you translate it, it means Western, education, something that is...
And haram forbidden.
And haram is forbidden. Why would they say Western education is forbidden?
That's the name of the group.
Yeah. The reason why they say that is that those who govern Nigeria do so using certificates from Western education system, using democracy. But all that it has been promoting since Nigeria's independence in 1960 is corruption, injustice. So their thinking is, if Western education will bring corruption and injustice, then it's haram. Let us look for an alternative system that will eliminate corruption, that will eliminate injustice. And that alternative system should be Sharia law, should be Sharia governance. This, for me, is a legitimate kind of grievance. The only problem is the method through which they implement and execute. There was no need for them to kill innocent civilians.
But look, all these groups which you have mentioned, Al-Qaeda grew out of the United States war in Afghanistan. The Saudis sent fighters there to help the Americans, and when the war against the Russians was over, Al-Qaeda became what it now is. Obama, the American president, said just a few weeks ago that the Islamic State, ISIS as it's known, was created because we invaded Iraq. Before that, they didn't exist. So this is the American president admitting that a US war has created this group. Now you are saying that brutalities by the state in Nigeria triggered off a new development within a traditional conservative Islamist organization which sent it on its path. Then we read just last week that the United States are now planning a huge military presence in virtually in every major United States country. AFRICOM had a meeting with 13 other Western nations involved to secure to defend what they call the security of Africa against terrorism, probably in reality to tell the Chinese, we are watching. You can be here economically, but not militarily. But this is the situation. Now, is there a way out of it, in your opinion?
I think there is a way out of this. One of the ways is that of regional cooperation. Because if I went to where the area that Boko Haram operates is at the Lake Chad border region, you have to know that at this region, it was a flourishing Islamic empire, the Kanem Borno Empire. And this empire was literally divided when it was taken over by the French, the Germans, and the British. And up to today, you have this kind of spillover colonial alliances and grievances. And the Nigerian government didn't collaborate very, very much with its neighbors. After the girls were kidnapped, they couldn't even meet in Africa. They had to go to Paris in order to sit down and talk. So they had their own underground, kind of politics that actually derailed that kind of military collaboration. The reason why I say this is that at the moment, most of the Boko Haram territories have been retaken, but the girls have not been found. That means they are not within Nigerian territory. They probably have crossed over, either into Chad, Niger, or Cameroon. Then the other issue is that there must be a massive economic master plan for the whole of the Northeast. It is the most neglected region. I grew up there and I know what the people of that region up to today go through. Power and resources is highly concentrated in Abuja. It hardly reaches the fringes. And even when it does, it has to come through the politicians. And it trickles down and then nothing happens. So when you don't put all these things together, it's gonna be very, very difficult. With the multitude of young people we have, particularly in northern Nigeria. Young people who have graduated for the past 10 years. They have no job. They come back home and rely on the very salary of their parents that trained them in the university in the first place. You cannot have this kind of young people and you allow them to litter the streets. You are asking for trouble.
Returning to Indian politics, if nothing emerges from the collapse of the left or even the Congress to challenge what's going on, it's an incredibly depressing situation, especially that, you know, you've written about the peasant rebellions, which are called Maoist and of course involve some Maoists, but they had a very heroic character, in my opinion. They were the only people in India fighting for the poor and challenging the power of the state.
It's not just the Maoist movement in the forest that is, there's a kind of landscape, and I keep saying there has to be a diversity of resistance, like a biodiversity of resistance. You know, inside the forest, you can't go on a hunger strike or do some Gandhian tactics when 1,000 troops come and burn your village and rape your women. Equally, outside in the plains, it's hard to have armed struggle because there's no shelter, you know. So, rather than look at these things ideologically, we should be looking at them tactically. And I would say it's immoral for people in Delhi to sit and advise the Adivasi in the forest when his house or her house is being burnt and they are being raped and murdered, to say, oh, you must be Gandhian about it, they should be allowed to decide what they want to be, But so there is a diversity of resistance of all kinds. There was, and this is what I'm saying I'm so worried about, that was in some ways co-opted and reduced. But the way things move now, Tariq, I mean, you never know. I'm not, in any case, it's not in my DNA to sit around moping and feel gloomy. I'm sure something will happen because the level of insanity and absurdity that's going on. I mean, you have a prime minister who's saying the solution to climate change is yoga, and the Hindus discovered plastic surgery. How else could you have an elephant god? I mean, there's a limit to how, and to try and posit this as common people's knowledge is so wrong, because common people are wise people,
Exactly.
and they are trying to put their idiocy as some kind of the common man.
But atrocities can carry on in India, in the forests, as we were just talking about, or in Kashmir, or in Manipur, where the rapes had become awful and unbearable. And no one outside really sits up and talks. The image is the world's largest democracy.
Well, I mean, it was interesting, the world went crazy about that December gang rape and murder, right? But when that happened, they still don't, I mean, every journalist that passes through Delhi wants to talk to me about rape, as if I'm the Ministry of Rape or something, But they don't want to remember that, for example, when Modi was the Chief Minister of Gujarat, hundreds of Muslim women were gang raped and burnt on the streets. So the thing is that, of course, this form of capitalism that India has adopted, like I said, it's, this cross ownership of businesses, this kind of full spectrum domination. No, people don't want to talk about it because it's being seen as the new investment destination. I mean, I saw a woman, a feminist from the left in America, writing on the Huffington Post about how Modi was a feminist, right? Because he had talked about rape. The man who, when he was asked about female malnutrition, said, oh, that's because these women are diet conscious.
It is the middle of September in the year 2014, and a tiny nation relative to the big states of this world, a nation of 5 million people, has suddenly become the focus of attention all over the globe. How is it that so many Scottish people now feel that independence is the only way in which Scotland can realize its full political and cultural potential in the 21st century? The new nationalism that is much talked about was essentially the result of a democratic deficit. The bulk of Scotland, for instance, voted against Margaret Thatcher 3 times and felt that they were no longer represented in the English Parliament. Often when one visited Scotland in those days, people would say, it's none of our business, we voted against all that. We voted against her brutal dismantling of the 1945 Compact. And it was that that shook the Union's foundations. Initially, there were hopes that Labour would be different, but when Tony Blair followed suit, mimicking Thatcher and belittling the Scottish Parliament to be as little more than a local council, the hemorrhaging of Labour votes began. Labour's more enlightened leaders on this question, John Smith and the late Donald Dewar, both important politicians in Scotland, had assumed that devolution would solve the problem. But devolution did not permit the Scottish Parliament the right to levy taxes, and gradually demands began to mount that the Parliament needed more powers. And so it came about that the Scottish National Party changed as lots of Labour supporters, and in some cases a few Labour members of Parliament, joined it, and they began within the Scottish National Party to argue effectively for a social democratic Scotland, not a Thatcherite conservative Scotland. And then what happened was a campaign of fear began, based on dodgy statistics, fear-mongering, promoting the failed model of Anglo-globalization as the only alternative possible. And this campaign of fear succeeded, it has to be said, in frightening the more elderly sections of the Scottish population. For the first time, Scotland's sovereignty, honour and dignity was within the grasp of its own people. For the first time really ever, but certainly since 1707. Would the parcel of rogues triumph again? That became the key question at an early stage of the campaign. I visited Scotland twice, and during 2 trips this summer, witnessed a society that was very much alive, unlike its southern big brother. It was intellectually exhilarating to witness and participate in the serious debates taking place in meeting halls, in kirks, in streets, in pubs and homes. What a contrast to dreary old England, where all 3 parties and every single media outlet came out against Scottish independence. The No campaign, waged by the coalition, including the so-called Labour opposition, lacked any sense and subtlety. I think the movement is now so far advanced that if the Scots feel dissatisfied still, which I'm sure they will, in a few years' time, there will be a huge demand for another referendum, and this time they will make it.